Greetings, my good students. Brian Doak here. Hope you're all doing really well. Did you know that you could view your suffering and your pain as amazing, as the best thing that's ever happened? We're going to explore this idea in this particular video lecture, in which we take a turn toward some ideas not in the Bible, but rather ideas that were very important to early Christian thinkers, particularly some ideas from Plato, the famous Greek philosopher, as well as the so-called Stoic philosophers. We take this turn toward philosophy and theology because our topic, as you've gathered probably already, is a very difficult one. And Christians have for many, many hundreds of years, indeed for almost 2 millennia now, have drawn on the riches of deep, hard thinking, have drawn on philosophy in order to create what we might call theology. Theology is a fancy word which can mean, in a basic sense, organized, rational thinking about God. Do Christians need theology? Well, yeah, I think we do. I think insofar as we are rational creatures. The book of Genesis chapter 1 famously says that humans are made in the image of God. Insofar as we're rational creatures, we inherit that presumably from God, that sense of rationality and clear thinking and this need to express ourselves in complex ways with each other. This doesn't mean that everyone expresses themselves in a similarly complex way, or that somehow in a Christian worldview that in order to approach God, we have to approach God like with some huge education and with all kinds of fancy words. No, it doesn't mean that at all. However, but for those of us who do have education and do have the extreme privilege of being able to read and being able to study, we're responsible for the gifts and the rationality and the kind of structure and the support that we've been given. And so for those of you out there in college, this means that to exercise your rational capacity, to organize yourself, to make it through a course of study, this is something that you're definitely capable of. And so if you're a Christian, we owe it to our Creator, to God, and also to each other in community to really make the best of our study and to do hard work in theology and even philosophy in order to understand who we are and in order for our faith to be understood, to make our faith understood to others and even to ourselves. So this turn to philosophy and theology is really natural for Christians that we're doing in this particular lecture, and there'll be some others in this series later as well, where we'll continue to examine some authors and philosophers, some of whom are Christians, but some of whom are not, and their take on this problem of theodicy and suffering and pain and evil in the world. All right, first, let's give a little bit of background on these authors that we'll be talking about. Plato, super famous, famously was a student of Socrates, and Plato had a very famous student, Aristotle, and Aristotle was the teacher to Alexander the Great, who lived in the late 300s BC. So Plato's a figure in the earlier 300s BC. Who did a massive amount of writing. There's a philosophical joke out there that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. It's not a very funny joke because philosophers aren't that funny, okay? What can we say? But Plato is just huge. Some famous ideas that you might associate with Plato if you studied philosophy maybe in the past in high school or in another course, namely the idea of the forms. So Plato famously had this idea that there was some like heavenly world up there where true reality is, but we humans are kind of like down here below, down in the cave, as he famously expressed it in one very memorable metaphor. We're down in the cave. This is in the Republic, Book 7, if you're into looking stuff up. We're in the cave, and all we see are shadows of shadows of shadows of things. And our task is to kind of get up out of ourselves, even out of our bodies, out of material reality, and get into the heavenly sphere where we can see the sun. In a sense, we might say where we can see God and where we can really know things, okay? So Plato was very famous for this idea, and many others. The Stoics, the other group we're going to be looking at today, 2 authors from the Stoics, were a philosophical group that was founded in the 3rd century BC, so the 200s BC. And that group flourished really through the 200s AD. Stoic philosophy, though, didn't stop having its influence when Stoicism formally kind of wasn't around as a philosophical school in the ancient world, but rather a huge number of important Christian thinkers were heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy. Augustine, for example, major early Christian thinker, was very sympathetic to certain kinds of Stoic philosophy and ideas. Jerome, another one of the church fathers, Dante, the author of Paradise Lost, John Calvin, the famous Protestant reformer, and then major Enlightenment figures like Kant and Rousseau, also influenced by and read the Stoics. So Plato and the Stoics are big time for Christian thinkers. So we have to pay careful attention to the kinds of things that they say, not just as idle philosophical speculation, but because the ideas that they formulated, we're going to see them kind of come up again and again, and they have influence over Christian thought, okay, as it would be formulated later, Christian thought and theology. Okay, let's start with Plato. I want to look at a reading here. I'm accessing this reading from Mark Larimore's edited volume, The Problem of Evil. And this is from a book by Plato called the Timaeus. Timaeus was a very popular philosophical writing in the ancient world. Indeed, it was the only one of Plato's works that was translated and available for many hundreds of years to readers in the West. And so the Timaeus was super important. There's a particular part of the Timaeus I want to focus on in terms of thinking about theodicy and why we suffer and how are we supposed to think about our world. The Timaeus, by the way, as a dialogue or really just a philosophical work, is a kind of creation story. It's a philosophical creation story in which the speaker, a guy named Timaeus, it basically tells a story about how this particular god could hypothetically create a world and how it would be a certain kind of world. And I want to read from a meaty passage from Larimore's Reader. I'm on page 5 here from the Timaeus. I want to read a paragraph that gives us a very famous philosophical idea. So this is on page 5 of the Timaeus in Larimore's Reader. Timaeus says, "Let me tell you then why the Creator made this world of generation. He was good, the Creator was good, and the good can never have any jealousy of anything." He's never jealous, he's just good. Where have we seen that idea of goodness before? In the theodicy triangle, right? That God is good. This is a very popular idea theologically, the idea that the gods or God is good. And, being good and free from jealousy, he desired that all things should be as like himself as they could be. Why would they be otherwise, right? This is, in the truest sense, the origin of creation and of the world, as we shall do well in believing on the testimony of wise men. God desired that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as this was attainable. Wherefore, also finding the whole visible sphere not at rest, but moving in an irregular and disorderly fashion, out of disorder he brought order, considering that this was in every way better than the other. Sounds there kind of like, not totally unlike Genesis 1, the idea of God speaking light and calling order out of disorder. Now the deeds of the best could never be or have been other than the fairest, and the Creator, reflecting on the things which are by nature visible, found that no unintelligent creature taken as a whole could ever be fairer than the intelligent taken as a whole, and again that intelligence could not be present in anything which was devoid of soul. For which reason, when he was framing the universe, he put intelligence in soul, and soul in body, that he might be the creator of a work which was by nature fairest and best. On this wise, using the language of probability, we may say that the world came into being, a living creature truly endowed with soul and intelligence by the providence of God. Okay. There's a lot of complicated ideas in that passage maybe, and hopefully you'll be able to read this and try to make some sense of it for yourself. But I want to just focus on one aspect of this. Indeed, many philosophers picked up on Plato's ideas here in this passage and developed a kind of philosophical theory about our world and about suffering. We can call it the best of all possible worlds theory. Okay, the best of all possible worlds theory, and you see it in at least a simple form there in what I just read in Plato, and the form that I'll recite it in here was one that a philosopher by the name of Leibniz really formulated around the year 1710 AD. He was a famous philosopher who did a lot of work with theodicy. Indeed, he wrote a book called Theodicy, from whence we get the term theodicy. So Leibniz is a big figure. But so I'm going to give you Leibniz's sort of formulation of this in a very simplified way. But it's basically all there in the Plato that I just read. The best of all possible worlds idea goes like this. Number one, God has the idea in God's mind of infinite universes and worlds. Okay? God is so smart. God is so all-powerful. He just has every idea in his mind, and he could imagine every possible thing that could ever be. Okay? You with me? Number two, only one of these possibilities can and does exist. It's our world. So God imagines many universes. If you asked God to imagine some universes, he could just imagine 50 billion trillion universes. Just some huge number that can't even be imagined. But only one of those exists. It's our world. Okay? Seems pretty obvious. I mean, maybe there are other parallel universes, but I guess in Leibniz's thinking, for the purpose of this theory, there's only one. Okay? Many possibilities, but one exists. When God chose this one, which apparently he did, God has reasons to choose one thing over another. God is not amoral in this theory. He has definite ideas, definite plans, definite reasons to do what he does. So God does things for a reason. Okay, and then finally, to cap it all off, God chose this world. God chose our world, the one that exists now. So out of infinite possibilities, a good God chose only this world, and therefore, what does that imply about this world that God chose? Do you have any guesses? It's the best! Okay? God chose it, and it's the best. He chose it because it's the best, and because he's perfect, and why would he choose anything other than what's best? Okay. Using some of Plato's terms, if God is, and I'll just open the text here so I can mirror the correct terminology. God desired that all things should be good and nothing bad. Of course, why would he, he's good, so he desires good. Does that make sense? So the best of all possible worlds theory says this world in which we're living could not be any better than it is. It couldn't be any better. Why? Because God would have chosen it. If there could have been a better world God would have chosen, God would have to be super, super mean in order to have chosen a world that is not the best one he could have chosen. So this has implications then for theodicy. They're not really spelled out. I mean, the best of all possible worlds theory doesn't give you a full theodicy on its own terms, but it does kind of point you in a direction. It starts you thinking along a certain line, namely this. Maybe there's really nothing wrong with the world. Maybe this world is as good as it can be, and maybe this world is actually great. It seems to have problems, but it's maybe like the best God could possibly do, given whatever kind of limitations the system seems to have. Okay. So from Plato, I want you to get this idea from that reading, part of which I just read. I want you to get this idea of the best of all possible worlds. Okay. In some ways, this idea meshes well with the theodicy thinking of the Stoics. Okay, of the Stoics. And in particular, I want to look at two Stoic philosophers, Seneca and Epictetus. Seneca was maybe the most famous of the Stoic philosophers, so we'll start with him. Both of these are also in Larimer's Reader. The Seneca passage from his book On Providence, beginning on page 19. Seneca was big time, as I mentioned, read by a lot of key thinkers throughout history. Very influential. And Seneca has some very distinct ideas which really take us to the core of the Stoic idea about suffering and about pain and about evil, so-called evil in the world. What does Seneca have to say about this? The passage starts this way, at least the excerpt here in the Reader. Nature never permits good to be injured by good. Between good men and the gods there exists a friendship brought about by virtue. I'm skipping down a little bit. And so when you see that men who are good and acceptable to the gods labor and sweat and have a difficult road to climb, and that the wicked, on the other hand, make merry and abound in pleasures, reflect that our children please us by their modesty, while slave boys by their forwardness, that we hold in check the former by sterner discipline while we encourage the latter to be bold. Be assured that the same is true of God, Seneca says. He does not make a spoiled pet of a good man. He tests him, hardens him, and fits him for his own service. And now here we get the payoff. You ask, why do many adversities come to good men? In other words, in the terms of our theodicy triangle, why should good people suffer? I mean, this is another way of talking about that point on the triangle, evil. The suffering of good people. If you are a righteous person who's done no wrong and you suffer, how is that fair? Seneca says, why does that happen? Here's his answer. Get ready for it. No evil can befall a good man. Opposites do not mingle. So in other words, he says, oh, no, that's totally wrong. If you're a good person, you actually can't, there's no such thing as evil for you. If you're good and evil is evil, those are opposites. You can't mix opposites. Okay, what is that supposed to mean? How are we supposed to see suffering then? Is he saying that we don't suffer and nothing happens? He says, do you not see, this is on page 20, about middle of the page, do you not see how fathers show their love in one way and mothers in another? Toward good men, God has the love of a father. He cherishes for them a manly love. This is very gendered language. A manly love. And he says, let them be harassed by toil, by suffering, by losses, in order that they may gain true strength. Okay. So his idea is becoming clearer. He's saying we suffer because God wants us to, because it's like God is whipping us into shape. Let's keep reading on page 20. This much I now say, that those things which you call hardships and accursed are in the first place for the good of the persons themselves to whom they come. It's good for you, okay? This is kind of like an eat your vegetables theodicy. Eat your vegetables. You hate them, but they're good for you, okay? He says later on the page 20, to be always happy and to pass through life without a mental pang is to be ignorant of one half of nature. And he compares it to like an athletic competition, like the Olympic Games. And if you don't suffer enough, he says, I judge you unfortunate because you have never been unfortunate. You've passed through life without an antagonist. No one will know what you can do, not even yourself. That's bracing stuff, right? He says we need suffering to show us who we really are, to see what we're capable of, what we can really endure. What we need in life, Seneca says, is an antagonist, someone who will fight against us, suffering, pain, adversity, and show us what we're really made of, and then we can truly grow. Okay. So suffering in this view, it's not a punishment, it's a reward. Okay? It helps you be better. Page 22 is one of my favorite quotes from the Stoics. Indeed, one of my favorite quotes from this reader, from any author that we'll be looking at in these lectures. Page 22, but why, you ask? Why? Does God sometimes allow evil to befall good men? Assuredly he does not. Evil of every sort he keeps far from them. Sin and crime, evil counsel and schemes for greed, blind lust and avarice, intent upon another's goods. In other words, okay, evil is just like bad deeds that you do. And if you don't do those bad deeds, evil can't touch you. The good man himself he protects and delivers. Okay, here's the quote I like. Does anyone require of God that he should also guard the good man's luggage? You go through life with baggage, luggage, like through an airport, carrying your stuff, your money, your kids, your spouse, your possessions. He says, God's not responsible to guard your stuff. Who cares if a bunch of things happen to it? Okay? Now, we can sit back and we can think about this Stoic line. And Epictetus, as you'll see in his Enchiridion, says similar things. Epictetus says, this is on page 24 at 5a, people get upset not by what happens, but by their opinions on what happens. So, don't worry about it. Just have a different opinion, he says. Chapter 8, on page 25, do not seek to have events happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and all will be well with you. I mean, consider how tough this is as a theodicy, how hard this is to accept. Chapter 11, this is page 25, Epictetus. Never say in the case of anything, I have lost it, but rather say, I have given it back. Your child has died, it has been given back. Your wife has died, she's been given back. Your land has been taken from you, that too has been given back. But the one who took it from you is a wicked man. What concern of it is it of yours by whose intervention the giver asked it back from you? As long as these things are given to you, take care of them as things that belong to someone else, just as travelers mind the inn. I mean, take some time to really think about Stoic philosophy. I mean, it has a kind of like, you could see how someone could write a good like self-help book based on Stoic philosophy. Indeed, books like this have been written. The idea that it's like, look, like, just, it's all in your mind. Change the way that you think about the world. See yourself as part of a kind of an athletic training or a competition in which God, like a stern father, is trying to test you and teach you how to like be a real man, okay, as it were. Okay. Of course, women could apply this to themselves too, and many of us had stern mothers as well. So the imagery has a certain gendered slant for Seneca there, as I read it. But you can broaden it out. I mean, what do you make of this though? The idea that if you're righteous, really no evil can happen to you. Does that not diminish real suffering that is faced on earth? Is this a kind of philosophy only for just the toughest of the tough? Like, it sounds good, but could you actually carry this through in practice? And yet, this idea of seeing suffering and pain as something that can teach us, something that is sent by God specifically to test us, to shape us, and to make us into adults, is a very strong theodicy idea, one that we're going to have to come back to and contend with again and again throughout our lectures. All right, that's it for today. See ya. Bye-bye.